we're not in a quorum call, so you're free to go.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, there's a reason why 800 conservation organizations, every United States Secretary of Interior, from Babbitt to Zinke, and the President of the United States, President Trump, support the legislation that we're going to be voting on at about noon tomorrow. And that's because, in my view, and in the view of many others, it's the most important piece of conservation legislation that this country will have passed in at least a half century. And why is that? It's because it takes nearly $14 billion, up to $14 billion over the next 5 years, from energy exploration on our public lands, and spends it to cut in half the deferred maintenance backlog in our national parks, our national forests, our national refuges, and also to rebuild Indian schools. And in addition to that, it does something that Congress has been trying to do for 60 years, since the mid-1960s. It permanently funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which supplies both to the federal government and states money to create national parks and routes to fishing accesses and to other places in this country that we all treasure. In the middle of the Great Depression in the 1930s, the people of eastern Tennessee and western Carolina looked around and said, why are all the national parks out west? Well, it was because the federal government owned a lot of the land out west and carved a bunch of it up to make national parks. Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, other places that we know. So they looked around the United States and the East and said, where can we have a national park? And they settled on the Great Smoky Mountains. So they created a park that's half in Tennessee and half in North Carolina. Wasn't easy to do in the midst of the Great Depression. Governor Austin Peay of Tennessee brought the legislature, mostly Democrats, to Republican East Tennessee twice by train to see this 500,000 acres of land. The state of Tennessee couldn't come up with enough money to buy it. Neither could North Carolina. Then John D. Rockefeller Jr. offered $5 million in honor of his mother, Laura Spelman Rockefeller, if anybody would match it. And so the state legislatures in both states, Tennessee and North Carolina, appropriated $2 million each. And then the remaining $1 million was raised by public subscription. School children, teachers, people all over the region raised the money. And that $10 million bought 500,000 acres that today is visited by 12 million Americans every year. It's by far the most visited national park, attracting 2, 3, 4 times as many visitors as many of our most popular western parks, because it's located in the east and because it has the highest mountains in the east. But here's the problem with the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. The 12 million visitors a year are about to use it up. Too many of the 800 miles plus of trails are worn, so when you walk on them, you stumble. Too many of the roads are potholed. Too many of the roofs leak. There's one campground that I can see from my house almost on Chilhowie Mountain at the edge of the park called the Look Rock Campground that's been closed for 5 or 6 years because the sewage system won't work. 5,000 families that want to go up there and camp, and the sewage system won't work. And obviously, these aren't just Tennessee families. They're from all over the country. We have 6 or 7 million people live in Tennessee. We have 14 million visitors a year. So what this bill does is say to the Great Smoky Mountains, all right, you've got $224 million of deferred maintenance, of potholes, of worn trails, of sewage systems, of leaky roofs. $224 million, your operating budget is only $20 million a year. 10 to 12 times the amount of your operating budget is this deferred maintenance. It'll never get done. It'll never get done without a bill like this or this bill, which will say to the Smokies and to the National Mall and to the Pearl Harbor Visitor Center and to the Grand Canyon and all 419 of our national parks, we're going to cut half of the $12 billion deferred maintenance bill. We're going to cut half of that out over the next 5 years, and we're going to take money from exploration on energy lands, energy exploration on public lands, and use some of it for that. Now, not just our national parks. President Trump agreed. In fact, I talked to him about it on his trip to Tennessee when he came to visit the tornadoes. I said, Mr. President, the sponsors of our bill, Democrats and Republicans, would like to add to the bill our other public lands. We'd like to add the national forests. The Cherokee National Forest, for example, is in Tennessee and North Carolina. It's even bigger than the Smokies. It has 3 million visitors a year. It also has about $27 million of deferred maintenance. It'll never be able to do that without this bill or something like it. And I said, how about our wildlife refuges, Mr. President? We have the Tennessee Wildlife Refuge. It has $8 million of deferred maintenance. It won't be able to get the boat ramps right, so people can go fishing over by Kentucky Lake. The President said, I'll support it, put it in, if the Democrats and Republicans co-sponsoring the bill want it in there. And because he did, it's in there. It's in there just like the House of Representatives brought the bill out of its committee. It had those public lands in there. We didn't when it came out of our committee. It had the Land and Water Conservation Fund in the House, just as we did when it came out. Let's talk about the Land and Water Conservation Fund for a minute. That was supposed to be $900 million a year from oil and gas revenues that are spent by the federal government and by state governments to buy treasured lands. The senator from Montana, Senator Daines, says that in his state, 80% of the fishing accesses have been purchased by the Land and Water Conservation Fund. In my state, the governor opened a new park, Rocky Fork, a magnificent place in Upper East Tennessee, much of it purchased by Land and Water Conservation Fund money, $221 million into Tennessee since 1964, but that's not as much as it was supposed to be, because when this was enacted by Congress in 1964, at the recommendation of the Rockefeller Commission, the first Outdoor Recreation Review Commission, it was supposed to be $900 million a year. Environmental burden, that's the oil and gas drilling. Environmental benefit, that's the purchase of conservation land. The money gets credited over in the Treasury Department, but it doesn't get spent every year. This changes that. This is not just an idea of the Lawrence Rockefeller Commission in the 60s. In 1985 and 86, President Reagan appointed the President's Commission on Americans Outdoors. I chaired that commission, and the number one recommendation of the commission was permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So, Mr. President, since the mid-60s, good people in this body and good people outside of this body have been working to make the Land and Water Conservation Fund permanent and haven't been able to do that, but now we can. Now let's talk about the money for a minute. Senator Portman, a former director of the Budget Office, points out we're spending real money to reduce an unpaid debt. This isn't like just adding to the budget, which we do sometimes without paying for it. This is real money. If we don't produce enough oil this year, and last year we produced about $11.6 billion by selling energy produced on our public lands. If we don't produce the money, we don't spend it. And some have objected that it's mandatory and not paid for. That's a difference of opinion. The Office of Management and Budget has approved it. The President's budget has approved it. I think it's paid for because it's real money to reduce an unpaid debt. For example, we take some of the money from energy exploration, and if you live in Wyoming, you get 50% of it right off the top. If you live in Alaska, you get 90% right off the top. If you live in Louisiana, you get 27.5%, or any other coastal state, or you might get 37.5% from another area. All that money is mandatory in the sense that it has to be paid to those states every year. We're just taking some of that kind of money out of that pot after the others have been paid and spending it for this purpose. This would not have happened if it weren't for an unusual group of senators who've worked on this for a long time. Senator Burr and Cantwell, Senator Gardner and Manchin and Daines on the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And then on the park, Senator Warner and Senator Portman went to work early. Secretary Zinke came to see me in Tennessee 3 years ago and asked me to work on the parks bill. And I was delighted to find when Senator King and Heinrich and I began working on it, there were a number of us with the same idea. As I mentioned, President Trump has been behind it from the beginning and behind the expansion of it. And he is the first president that has allowed us to use money from energy exploration for this purpose, and he should deserve credit for that. Senator McConnell deserves credit. He has a lot that he could put on the floor, and he put this bill on the floor for 2 weeks. Only the majority leader can do that, and he did it. And I'm grateful to Senator Schumer and the Democratic leadership for creating an environment in which we could pass this bill in a bipartisan way. It is said that if you want to pass a big piece of legislation in the United States Senate, you need 3 things. One is an important objective that's good for the country. One is good relationships among the sponsoring senators, and one is a superior staff. We've had all 3 of those, and I would like to place into the record, or I think I will read them, the names of some of the staff members who've been so helpful to us. Curtis Swager and Jennifer Lorraine of Senator Gardner's office. Jason Thielman, Joshua Sizemore, Holly Hinojosa of Senator Daines' office. Lance West, David Brooks, Renee Black, Senator Manchin's office. Pam Thiessen, Sarah Perry of Senator Portman's office. Elizabeth Falcone and Micah Barber of Senator Warner's office. David Cleary, Lindsey Garcia, Allison Martin, Anna Newton of my staff. Chad Metzler, Morgan Cashwell, Kate DuRost of Senator King's office. Amit Ronan of Senator Cantwell's office. Maya Herman, and Virgilio Bajaria of Senator Heinrich's office. We thank them for their work. And then there are the advocates. Not many bills have more than 800 groups in its support. It's quite a coalition when you get President Trump and virtually all of the conservation, sportsman, angler, environmental groups behind the same bill. We owe all of them thanks for that. Sally Jewell, the former Secretary of the Interior, has been at the forefront of much of that, and we hope that once this passes the Senate tomorrow with a big vote, that they'll carry it across the finish line in the House of Representatives. Mr. President, the federal government is not always the most popular entity in the United States, but sometimes we are. When our military keeps the country safe, we're grateful for that. When the National Institutes of Health creates medical miracles, we're grateful for that. And we're grateful when the federal government creates 419 properties from the National Mall to Pearl Harbor, to the Grand Canyon, to the Great Smokies for us to enjoy and preserve. England has its history, Italy has its art, Egypt has its pyramids, but Mr. President, the United States of America has the great American outdoors. It is an essential part of the American character. And the Great Outdoors Act is an essential part of being good stewards of what Ken Burns has called our best ideas so that the next generation can enjoy the outdoors as this generation has been privileged to do. I thank the President. I yield the floor.